A $200 traffic ticket was about to destroy my 20-year marriage. But not because we couldn't afford it. The ticket itself was just a piece of paper. What it exposed was worth millions in divorce court. Imagine this. Your wife calls you at 8 p.m. on a Friday night. She's been pulled over by cops on some highway you've never been to. She needs you to drive 40 minutes to help her. You drop everything, race over there, and spend weeks preparing to fight the ticket in court. Only to discover that every single word she told you was a lie. And the worst part? She didn't call her lover for help that night. She called me. Her husband? While she was on her way to cheat on me with a 25-year-old kid. This story happened to me 6 months ago, and if my son stumbles across this video, that's fine. He's old enough to understand why his parents aren't together anymore. It started on a Friday evening in October. I wasn't even home myself yet, driving, when my phone rang. It was Melissa, my wife of 20 years. "Mark, where are you? Can you come out of town right now? I'm on the highway." Now, let me paint you a picture of our relationship. We're not young anymore, both in our late 40s. Our son Jake is about to finish high school. We've been together since college. I trust this woman with my life. So when she calls me sounding panicked, I don't ask questions. I just act. She gave me directions to some highway I'd never been to before. It would take me 40 minutes to get there. "What are you even doing out there?" I asked. "Well, Jessica asked me to give her a ride." She said, "Jessica, that's one of her college girlfriends." And on the way back, the cops pulled me over. I kind of drove into the oncoming lane a little, and now they want to suspend my license. Now here's what you need to understand about me. I'm not the kind of guy who tries to negotiate with police officers on the roadside. I'm not going to start yelling or making threats. Everything is recorded these days. You can't be sure they'll even pick up the phone if you try calling their supervisor. But I also wasn't about to let my wife lose her license without a fight. I told her, "Tell them you won't sign anything without me there. Stall for 20 minutes. It'll take me longer, but try to hold them off." I punched the location into my GPS and started driving. And during that 40-minute drive, I did what any good husband would do. I started preparing. I reminded myself of traffic law, what to look for in police reports, what kind of mistakes cops make when they're rushing through paperwork. Those 40 minutes of legal preparation would later prove invaluable. But not for getting her license back. For catching her in the biggest lie of our marriage. I had no idea that while I was racing across town to help my wife, she was probably texting someone else. Someone who should have been the one getting that phone call instead of me. When I arrived, I saw her car parked on the shoulder. Behind it was a white police cruiser with blue stripes. 2 officers were there, one older, one younger. They had already filled out most of the paperwork. The older cop looked at me and said, "You the husband?" "Yes, sir. What exactly happened here?" "Your wife crossed a double solid line into oncoming traffic. We've got it on dash cam video. She was trying to bypass some traffic congestion." I looked at the citation. Improper lane usage. $200 fine. Possible license suspension. The officers weren't interested in waiting around for me to review everything. They told me the whole thing would go to court anyway, and if I wanted to appeal, that's where I'd have to do it. So we signed the paperwork, took our copies, and drove home in separate cars. But here's what I didn't realize at the time. That signature on that police report was going to become Exhibit A in my divorce proceedings. Back at home, I spread the paperwork out on the kitchen table. I started asking Melissa basic questions about what happened. How did you not see them? The cops said they were right there with their lights on. If they were positioned there, you should have seen them. She got nervous. I could see it in her face, that look she gets when she's trying to remember a story she's told before. I just went around a traffic jam and turned toward the subdivision. They were parked right after the turn. It was my first time there. How was I supposed to know where they were positioned? First time there. Keep that phrase in mind, because we'll come back to it. At the time, I didn't know the exact layout of that area, so I let it slide. But something felt off. In 20 years of marriage, you develop an instinct for when your spouse isn't telling you the whole truth. A few days later, we went to the courthouse to get copies of all the documentation. I was preparing to fight this thing. My wife needed her license for her job. She works in pharmaceutical sales, constantly driving between doctors' offices. She couldn't afford to lose her driving privileges. But as I was preparing our defense, I kept coming back to that phrase, "It was my first time there." Something about it bothered me. Why would she emphasize that if it were true? At work the next Monday, I had some downtime, so I spread out all the police documents on my desk. The citation included a hand-drawn diagram of the intersection where she was stopped. According to the diagram, to turn left toward the subdivision, she had to cross a double solid line. There were 2 lanes going each direction, separated by those double yellow lines you're not supposed to cross. According to her story, she had bypassed traffic in the oncoming lane and then turned left toward the subdivision. That's when they stopped her. But here's the first major inconsistency, and I can't believe I missed it initially. She had told me she was driving back from dropping Jessica off. But according to the police report, they stopped her while she was driving into the subdivision, not leaving it. Think about that for a second. If she really had dropped Jessica off at her house in the subdivision, she would have been leaving the subdivision when the cops saw her. She would have just turned right onto the main road. No need to cross any double lines at all. But I was so focused on fighting the ticket that I pushed this inconsistency to the back of my mind. I figured maybe I had misunderstood her story. Maybe Jessica lived outside the subdivision and Melissa was just turning around or something. Looking back, that was my first mistake. Always trust your instincts when something doesn't add up. About a week later, I was going through our mail when I saw more envelopes addressed to Melissa from the Department of Motor Vehicles. Not just 1 or 2. I'm talking about 4 or 5 tickets. I opened them up. Speed camera violations. All from the same highway where she'd been pulled over. But here's the kicker. They were dated 10 days before the traffic stop. And 20 days before. And even a month before that. Remember what she told me? It was my first time there. I stared at these tickets for probably 10 minutes. Speed cameras don't lie. They've got timestamps. They've got photos of her license plate. Some of them even had clear photos of her face behind the wheel. So either my wife of 20 years had developed sudden amnesia about her driving habits, or she had been lying to me about where she was going on Friday nights. I confronted her that evening, laid the tickets out on the kitchen table like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Melissa, I thought you said this was your first time on that highway." She barely looked at the tickets. "Oh, those. I must have gotten confused. Jessica had me pick her up from different places a few times. I forgot about those other trips." But her explanation made even less sense. If Jessica needed rides that frequently, why hadn't I heard about it before? And why were all these trips happening on Friday evenings? That's when I decided to do something I'd never done in 20 years of marriage. I checked her phone records. Now, before you judge me, understand that we had a shared phone plan. Technically, I had access to all our phone records. I just had never felt the need to look before. I pulled up her call history for that Friday night when she'd been pulled over. According to her story, Jessica had called her around 6 p.m. asking for a ride. But there was no incoming call from Jessica at 6 p.m. In fact, there was no incoming call from Jessica at any time that day. What I found instead was much more interesting. There was an outgoing call from Melissa's phone to Jessica at 9:15 p.m., about 15 minutes after we'd finished dealing with the police and were driving home. Let me walk you through what this means. My wife hadn't received a call from Jessica asking for a ride. Instead, she had called Jessica after getting pulled over by the police. And I could only think of one reason why she would make that call. "Hey Jessica, if my husband asks, I was giving you a ride tonight. Can you cover for me?" I sat in my car, in the parking lot at work, staring at these phone records, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath me. 20 years of marriage, and I was looking at evidence that my wife was not just lying to me, but actively recruiting her friends to help maintain those lies. But I still didn't know what she was lying about. An affair seemed obvious, but I needed proof. And I was about to get more proof than I ever wanted. I started tracking the patterns in her phone records. Going back 3 months, I found that she had made trips to that same area every Friday night. Sometimes she'd be gone for 2 hours. Sometimes 4 hours. Always Friday nights. Always the same general area. And here's what really bothered me. On the nights she'd go out there, her phone would show very little activity. Almost like she was deliberately keeping it on silent. Or like she was somewhere she didn't want to be disturbed. The final piece of evidence I needed came from our credit card statements. I pulled 3 months of statements and highlighted every Friday night. Gas purchases in that part of town. Sometimes dinner purchases at restaurants I'd never heard of. Even a hotel charge one night when she told me she was staying late at the office. By this point, I wasn't investigating a traffic ticket anymore. I was investigating my marriage. After 2 weeks of gathering evidence, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to follow her. I borrowed my friend Dave's car, a gray Honda that looked nothing like my usual vehicle. I told Dave I was having marital issues and needed to borrow it for one evening. He didn't ask questions. That Friday, I left work early and parked about 2 blocks from our house. At 6:30 p.m., I watched Melissa leave in her car, heading in the direction I now knew by heart. I followed her at a distance, staying far enough back that she wouldn't notice me. We drove for about 35 minutes, through parts of town I rarely visited. Expensive neighborhoods. The kind of area where houses start at $2 million. She was definitely alone in the car. No Jessica. No girlfriends. Just my wife, driving to meet someone I was about to see for the first time. The subdivision she entered was one of the richest in the state. Big houses, manicured lawns, gates that cost more than my car. She knew exactly where she was going. No GPS, no hesitation at intersections. She'd clearly made this drive many times before. She pulled into the driveway of a colonial-style house with a circular driveway, two-car garage, probably worth $2 million. The kind of house we'd always talked about buying someday when we could afford it. I parked about 50 yards away and watched. At first, nothing happened. Then, the front door opened, and out walked this kid. And I mean kid, he couldn't have been older than 25. Blonde hair, athletic build, wearing what looked like expensive casual clothes. He walked over to her car with this huge smile on his face. And then I watched my wife of 20 years get out of her car and kiss this kid like she was 22 years old again. Not a peck on the cheek. Not a friendly hug. I'm talking about the kind of kiss you see in movies. Passionate. Intimate. The kind of kiss that tells you everything you need to know about a relationship. Then he got behind the wheel of her car and drove it into the garage. Like they'd done this routine dozens of times before. I sat in that borrowed Honda for what felt like 10 minutes, just processing what I'd seen. This wasn't a one-night stand. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment mistake. This was a full-blown relationship, complete with established routines and obvious comfort levels. But here's what really got to me. When she'd been pulled over by those cops, when she'd needed help with a potentially serious legal problem, she hadn't called him. She'd called me. Her husband, the man she was betraying every Friday night. That phone call suddenly made perfect sense. This kid was probably 25 years old. What was he going to do with 2 police officers and a traffic citation? He probably didn't even know how to handle a situation like that. So when she needed real help, adult help, she called the man she'd been married to for 20 years. I was furious, but I was also weirdly satisfied. Because now I knew. After weeks of investigation, after all those inconsistencies and lies, I finally knew the truth. I got out of the car and walked up the driveway. The kid was just coming back out of the garage when he saw me approaching. He looked confused, but not alarmed. "Hello, do you need something?" he asked. Before I could answer, Melissa appeared from behind the garage. When she saw me, the color drained from her face. The kid looked back and forth between us. "Melissa, do you know this man?" And that's when I realized something that hadn't occurred to me before. This kid had no idea she was married. From his perspective, I was just some random stranger walking up the driveway. She'd obviously told him she was divorced, or single, or widowed. Whatever story she'd invented to justify why a 47-year-old woman was available every Friday night. I looked directly at her and said, "So this is your Jessica ride, huh? This is why you were always speeding on that highway. This is why you had all those tickets I found. And this is why you called me that night instead of him, because he's just a kid who couldn't help you with the police." The kid's face went from confused to shocked to something like understanding. "Wait, are you her husband?" I said, 20 years next month. Or it would have been. What happened next isn't really important. There was yelling, there were tears, there were accusations and denials, and eventually admissions. Melissa tried to explain. She said she felt old. She said she felt invisible. She said this kid made her feel young again. All the usual justifications people give when they've been caught destroying their marriages. The kid, to his credit, seemed genuinely shocked that she was married. He kept saying he would never have gotten involved if he'd known. I actually believed him. But here's the ironic ending to this whole story. Remember that traffic ticket we were supposed to fight in court? Without me preparing her defense, without me there to guide her through the legal process, she ended up losing her license for 6 months. So now she's taking buses to see her 25-year-old boyfriend in his parents' expensive subdivision. Because yes, it turns out he still lives with his parents. They just go out of town every weekend, leaving him the house. She's 47 years old, riding public transportation for 2 hours each way to spend Friday nights with a kid who has to wait for his parents to leave before he can have company over. She wanted to feel young again. Mission accomplished. As for me, our son is turning 18 soon. He understands. And honestly, I don't feel bad about walking away. She made her choice. She wanted her freedom, and now she has it. The only thing I regret is not trusting my instincts sooner. When something doesn't add up in your relationship, don't ignore it. Don't rationalize it away. Don't give the benefit of the doubt when the evidence is staring you in the face. Sometimes a simple traffic ticket is just a traffic ticket. But sometimes it's the thread that, when you pull it, unravels everything. If this story hit close to home, or if you've lived through something similar, drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if you've got a story of your own, something raw and real about navigating the mess of modern relationships, send it my way. You'll find my contact details in the description. Who knows, your story might be the next one featured here. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned, because the next story might just make this one look tame.